Today, the M1 is one of the most important roads in Britain. It carries thousands of vehicles every day, including a huge number of lorries that keep the country supplied. But before the M1, Britain had no motorways at all. No high-speed roads, no dedicated routes for long-distance travel. So how did the M1 come to exist? And how did it completely change the way Britain moves goods and people? By the late 1940s, Britain's main roads were already struggling under the weight of a changing nation. Most trunk A roads, like the A41 and A5, dated back to a time when lorries were rare and cars were smaller. Their carriageways measured just 18 to 28 feet across, barely enough for two modern lorries to pass safely. Bridges and tunnels, some with clearances as low as 9 feet, forced drivers of taller vehicles to detour for miles. On paper, these routes connected London with the industrial Midlands, but in reality, they had become a tangled web of bottlenecks and slow-moving queues. Traffic studies from the early 1950s painted a stark picture. Average speeds on straight A roads hovered between 30 and 35 miles per hour, but any stretch with bends, villages or narrowings could drag that down to under 20. For hauliers, the impact was brutal. A Birmingham to London freight run that took 6 hours before the war was now stretching to 10. Lorry drivers faced endless stops at unsynchronized junctions, unpredictable delays, and detours around low bridges. Every extra hour on the road meant higher costs, missed delivery windows, and goods arriving late to market. The London to Midlands corridor was the worst offender. In the summer of 1954, the AA recorded more than 4,000 vehicles per hour on the A41, between Watford and Hemel Hempstead, far above the 2,500 per hour these roads were designed to handle. Queue lengths stretched for miles, especially during the August holiday rush or October market weeks. On market days, average speeds dropped to 12 or 15 miles per hour and journey times ballooned by 45% compared to quieter periods. Accident reports highlighted the risk. On some stretches, more than a fifth of serious collisions happened at notorious bottlenecks like Northampton's old junctions and the stone bridges at Milton Keynes. The numbers told a clear story. Britain's post-war road system was not just congested, it was actively holding back the movement of goods, raising freight costs and putting both drivers and cargo at risk. For hauliers, every lost hour was a lost opportunity. Political pressure mounted as motoring clubs, members of parliament and industry leaders demanded a solution that would break the gridlock and restore Britain's ability to move freight efficiently. Long before the first stretch of the M1 was poured, British engineers were already searching for answers abroad. The German Autobahn, rebuilt and expanded in the 1930s, stood out as a working example of what a true high-speed road could achieve. Its continuous carriageways, strict grade separation and wide lanes offered a blueprint that British planners studied closely. In 1949, the Road Research Laboratory translated the German Autobahn technical guidelines, circulating them through the Ministry of Transport and shaping every major policy report that followed. The lessons were clear: a motorway had to be more than just a widened A road. German practice called for lanes 3 meters wide, continuous hard shoulders and entry and exit only at carefully designed slip roads. British engineers, led by Sir William Halcrow, debated every detail. Should the hard shoulder match the Autobahn's 2.5 meters or be widened to 3 meters to help breakdowns and larger lorries? The answer was found in the numbers. Haulage firms needed reliability as much as speed, and a wider shoulder meant fewer stranded vehicles blocking the flow. Italy's autostrade offered a different kind of inspiration. These roads, built from the 1920s onwards, introduced the idea of regular service areas spaced every 30 kilometres where drivers could refuel, eat and rest. British delegations returned from Milan and Rome with notes on everything from bridge aesthetics to the spacing of petrol stations. The Italian model also sparked debate over tolls, but Britain ultimately chose a toll-free system, aiming for a motorway open to all, not just those who could pay. The Road Research Laboratory's 1952 report distilled these lessons into a clear set of standards: full-grade separation, 3-metre lanes, wide shoulders and service stations at regular intervals. The toolkit was ready. Britain now had the technical foundation for a motorway system built not on guesswork, but on tested ideas from the continent, adapted for the demands of British freight and the realities of post-war traffic. With these principles in hand, the next challenge was deciding where the first motorway should run. The decision to carve Britain's first motorway through the London to Mean Midlands corridor was never just about drawing a straight line on a map. By the early 1950s, freight density surveys from the Road Research Laboratory left no room for doubt. This stretch bore the heaviest load in the country, moving nearly 1.8 million tonnes of goods each year, almost a third of all national road freight. Lorries struggled through Northampton's tangled junctions, where a simple market day could turn a main artery into a maze of delays. The numbers were impossible to ignore: 45-minute hold-ups at notorious bottlenecks, average speeds collapsing to a crawl, and delivery schedules thrown into chaos. Inside Parliament, the pressure was relentless. Midlands MPs, speaking for Coventry, Birmingham, Leicester and the industrial heartland, pressed the Ministry of Transport with a single question: how could Britain compete if its main freight route was strangled by outdated roads? Hansard records from 1957 catch the urgency in their words: calls to bypass Northampton's choke points and end the costly stops that impair our freight carriers. The ministry's planners faced a stark choice. Other routes, westward across the Chilterns or east through flatter farmland, offered alternatives, but each came with steep costs or missed the densest clusters of factories and warehouses. The chosen alignment, running north from London and skirting the Midlands manufacturing belts, promised direct access to steelworks, car plants and distribution hubs. Geography played its part too. The relatively flat ground meant less earth to move, fewer tunnels to dig, and a faster, cheaper build, critical in an era still shaped by post-war austerity. The logic was freight first, politics second. A motorway here would cut hours off long-distance hauls, slash costs for manufacturers, and untangle the web of delays that had become a national embarrassment. The Ministry of Transport, under mounting scrutiny, locked in the route. With the corridor decided, the stage was set for Britain's first true motorway, one designed not for the leisurely Sunday drive, but for the relentless movement of goods that powered the nation's recovery. On the morning of November the 24th, 1959, a ribbon of fresh tarmac stretched from St Albans to Rugby, ready for its first journey into British history. Crowds lined the embankments, bundled against the November chill, drawn by the promise of something entirely new, a road built not for the horse and cart, but for a nation on the move. The BBC Home Service interrupted its regular broadcast with a special bulletin. Today Britain enters the motorway age. Listeners heard the hum of engines, the measured voice of the announcer, and the excitement in the air as the inaugural convoy prepared to roll. At the head of the procession, Minister of Transport Ernest Marples stepped forward, coat buttoned, to declare the motorway open. His words echoed across the tarmac: "This is the road of the future." Behind him, a line of gleaming cars and lorries inched forward, their drivers peering out at a scene that felt more like science fiction than English countryside. Photographers jostled for position as the first vehicles crossed the starting line, their wheels tracing a path that would soon become the backbone of Britain's transport system. Local newspapers captured the spectacle with front-page headlines that read "Thousands gather for motorway debut," and photographs of children waving Union Jacks as the convoy swept by. For many, this was their first glimpse of a road without crossroads, traffic lights, or the constant stop-start of the old A roads. One driver interviewed by the St Albans Gazette described the sensation. It felt like flying. No villages, no bends, just open road ahead. The motorway's wide lanes and smooth surface delivered a sense of freedom unknown to British motorists. Lorry drivers, used to crawling through bottlenecks and wrestling with gears in crowded towns, found themselves gliding north at speeds they'd only dreamed of. The novelty was as much psychological as physical, a sudden leap from clogged, unpredictable roads to a streamlined corridor built for progress. As dusk fell and the inaugural traffic thinned, the M1 stood revealed not just as a feat of engineering, but as a symbol of modern Britain. Its opening was more than an event, it was a promise that the country could reinvent how people and goods moved. In the days that followed, the press and public alike would marvel at the motorway's scale and ambition, even as questions about its limitations and future began to surface. The M1's original blueprints promised a leap into the future, but the choices made by its engineers would soon draw as much scrutiny as praise. Each carriageway was built with 2 lanes, each measuring 3.65 metres wide. Wider than any A road at the time. This allowed lorries and cars to travel side by side at higher speeds, yet for all this width, the design left out 2 features that would become flashpoints: a continuous hard shoulder and a central barrier. Instead, emergency laybys appeared only at intervals, and for the first 12 miles north of St Albans, the central reservation was nothing more than a grass strip. There was no physical barrier to prevent vehicles from crossing into oncoming traffic. Speed was another area where the M1 broke with tradition. Rather than imposing a hard limit, the Ministry of Transport set an advisory maximum: 70 miles per hour for cars and 60 miles per hour for lorries. These limits were not enforced. The open road quickly became a proving ground for drivers eager to test the limits of their vehicles. Police reports from the winter of 1959 recorded cars reaching 90 and even 100 miles per hour, while lorries routinely exceeded the recommended speed. The Institution of Civil Engineers, in papers published between 1960 and 1963, raised early warnings. Experts questioned whether omitting a hard shoulder and a central barrier truly saved money, or simply shifted risk onto drivers. They pointed to the German autobahn's use of continuous shoulders and the American preference for steel guardrails, asking why Britain had chosen a more minimal approach. The answer found in ministry correspondence was cost. Every extra metre of pavement or steel meant fewer miles of motorway could be built with the budget at hand. As the first months unfolded, the trade-off became clear. The motorway's wide lanes and smooth surface delivered speed and efficiency, but the absence of protective features left drivers exposed to dangers that would soon demand urgent attention. For Britain's hauliers, the arrival of the M1 was nothing short of a revolution. Before the motorway, the cost of running a 1-ton lorry on worn, congested A roads averaged 18 pence per mile. On the new motorway, that figure dropped to just 12 pence, a saving that rippled through every link in the supply chain. The numbers mattered. For a long-distance operator running daily between London and Birmingham, the difference could mean thousands of pounds reclaimed over a year. Journey Times told a similar story. The M1 made overnight express freight not just possible, but routine. Schedules that once required a driver to leave at dusk and arrive at dawn could now be completed in half the time, with lorries reliably covering the London to Midlands stretch in under 3.5 hours. This new certainty allowed manufacturers to promise next-day delivery, reshaping expectations across the retail and industrial sectors. Haulage managers described the change in plain terms. As one Road Haulage Association director put it in a 1961 interview, "We used to budget for delays and detours. Now, with the motorway, we budget for reliability." The ability to plan with confidence meant less wasted fuel, fewer missed deadlines, and tighter control over costs. For the first time, British logistics could match the pace and predictability of continental rivals. The commercial success of the M1 was impossible to ignore. Its cost savings and schedule reliability became the strongest argument for expanding the motorway network nationwide. In Whitehall, policymakers pointed to freight figures from the M1 as proof that modern roads were not just a convenience. They were a necessity for economic growth. The early performance of the M1 became the foundation for a new national strategy. Within 2 years of its opening, policy papers in Whitehall cited the motorway's freight savings and reliability as evidence that the experiment should not end at Rugby. The Ministry of Transport's 1961 White Paper, backed by cost-benefit analyses, called for a rapid expansion of the motorway model, first with the M6, linking Birmingham to the northwest, then the M62, stretching across the Pennines, and finally the M25, encircling London. Funding approvals for these projects referenced traffic counts and accident reports on the M1, arguing that the same principles, wide lanes, grade separation, controlled access, could deliver similar results across the country. Transport planners, emboldened by the impact of the M1 on haulage and industry, mapped out a network intended to connect every major industrial region. The blueprint was clear: take what worked on the M1, adapt where needed, and build a system that would carry Britain's economy into a new era of mobility. By the early 1960s, the M1 had already begun to outgrow its original form. Traffic counts surged well beyond projections, with lorries and private cars often filling both lanes from dawn until dusk. Engineers from the Ministry of Transport, led by Chief Project Manager Sir John Jones, faced a mounting challenge: how to keep Britain's main artery flowing as demand soared. The solution came in phases. In 1965, the first major extension pushed the motorway north from Rugby to Leeds, adding over 70 miles and connecting new industrial regions. This was not just a matter of pouring more tarmac. Each new section required fresh junctions, carefully designed to handle growing freight volumes and the shifting patterns of long-distance travel. By the 1970s, it was clear that 2 lanes in each direction were no longer enough. Projects to add a third and later a fourth lane began in the busiest stretches, particularly between London and Northampton, where freight traffic was heaviest. Between 1986 and 1999, contractors widened key segments and rebuilt junctions to accommodate modern heavy goods vehicles and rising commuter flows. The M1's evolution was relentless. More lanes, stronger bridges, and smarter interchanges followed, each addition a direct response to the pressures of a nation on the move. Rush hour on the M1 today means crawling queues, warning signs flashing overhead, and a steady stream of lorries threading between commuter cars. Despite decades of upgrades, congestion is a constant companion, especially near Northampton and Watford, where weekday traffic can drop below 30 miles per hour. Every day, thousands of heavy goods vehicles depend on this corridor, with Department for Transport counts showing over 140,000 lorries using the central section daily. In the cab, drivers talk of lost hours and unpredictable delays, while logistics managers recalculate delivery times with every new maintenance scheme or lane closure. Efforts to keep the motorway moving have sparked fierce debate. The 1990s saw a controversial trial of an 80 miles per hour speed limit, abandoned in 1995 after a spike in heavy goods vehicle accidents. More recently, the rollout of smart motorways, removing the hard shoulder and relying on dynamic lane controls, has divided opinion. Safety advocates warn of increased risks when breakdowns force vehicles to stop in live lanes, while government reports claim that variable speed limits have cut overall collision rates. Groups like the AA and the RAC have called for a pause, citing the 215 serious incidents recorded on smart sections between 2015 and 2023. Yet for the freight industry, the M1 remains irreplaceable. No other route carries as much of the nation's goods, and every delay ripples through supply chains across Britain. The motorway's future now hangs on finding a balance between capacity, safety, and the relentless demands of modern logistics. Britain's economy now relies on seamless movement. Every supermarket aisle, factory line, and delivery schedule depends on motorways born from that first bold experiment. As freight volumes soar and infrastructure ages, the challenge isn't building roads, it's keeping a nation connected, supplied, and moving forward. The future of Britain's logistics begins and endures on tarmac laid over 60 years ago. What will we demand of our roads next?